Earlier this year, the Kofi Annan Foundation presented their report on elections with data from over 80 elections. To give you more information about this work, we are delighted to present Professor Stephen Stedman, a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, professor of political science at Stanford, and Secretary General of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Professor Stedman, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just to clarify, I'm not the Secretary General of the Kofi Annan Foundation, but rather the Secretary General of the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Age. It was about a year ago, in fact, that we issued we finished our report and we launched it in January. Greetings from the United States, which right now is a political bonfire. According to Alex Stamos, who was one of our commissioners on the Kofi Annan Commission and the former chief security officer at Facebook, we're living through the largest disinformation campaign in history, all aimed at trying to convince people that the American election was stolen from Donald Trump. The good news is that campaign is going to lose, and there is going to be a transfer of power in January from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. But of course, this is a battle and it's not the war, that the United States may have won this battle against disinformation, but the long-term effects are going to be with us, and in the future, we are going to have to deal with the fallout having to do with a greater sense of delegitimacy involving our elections as we go forward. I'll talk about the U.S. case, but I want to talk about it in the context of the Kofi Annan Commission. Kofi Annan is a long-time supporter of integrity in elections. He chaired a commission from 2010 to 2012, which was on how best to promote and protect the integrity of elections. He grew increasingly worried about the effects of social media and the internet on elections and on democracy. And so in 2018, he created this new commission, which was to look at how social media affects elections and the integrity of elections. Unfortunately, he passed away before the commission got off the ground, but as a way of honoring him and his legacy, we went forward. And as I said, we've really finished our work about a year ago. So let me start by saying the report says how not to think about the problem. The sort of journalistic version of how to think about the problem of social media and democracy is that social media creates polarization, it causes distrust, it causes the decline of political parties, and it creates filter bubbles and echo chambers. And we looked at all of the research that's extant on these claims, and we think we have a better way of thinking about this. So first of all, many of the ills that are attributed to social media pre-exist social media. Polarization, for instance, in the United States has been on the rise since the 1970s. Distrust in Europe and across the world in terms of people's distrust in their politicians has been on a decline for about 20 years, although there's mixed evidence on that. Different places have fared better than others. Political parties everywhere have been on decline since the early 1980s. And there's very mixed evidence on the filter bubble echo chamber claims. And so a different way of thinking about it from our report is to think that where you have pre-existing political polarization, distrust of people in the media, distrust of authorities, distrust of each other, and you have partisan media, where you have those three things: existing polarization, existing distrust, existing partisan media. Those countries are going to be the most vulnerable to what we call weaponized disinformation or network propaganda. Weaponized disinformation can be foreign, but actually the bigger problem that we've discovered over the last year, of course, is that it's very much rooted in domestic politics. And certainly in the United States right now, the biggest problem is domestic disinformation, domestic weaponized disinformation. Now, the platforms and social media have a big role to play in this. But it's not just the platforms, and I want to come back to this point. Weaponized disinformation is a problem of the platforms, but it's also a problem of irresponsible politicians, and it's also a problem of irresponsible media. So what do I mean by this? The best work, I think, on this is Yochai Benkler at Harvard and his folks at Harvard and MIT. They wrote a very good book on this called Network Propaganda. And again, using the US example, the biggest spreader of disinformation in the United States over the last several years has not been Breitbart or InfoWars or any online source that you want to come up with. The biggest spreader of disinformation in the United States has been Donald Trump and Fox News. And in fact, the way that you have to think about disinformation in the United States is an ecosystem of a triangle of the president and his cronies and his enablers within the Republican Party, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, folks like that, and then the sort of peripherally Breitbart, InfoWars, et cetera. You know, it's just to remind you that sort of back before the days of QAnon, Fox News twice ran the story that Hillary Clinton was in charge of a pedophile ring run out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. So this is crazy stuff, and you can't just put this on the internet. These are supposed to be responsible media and responsible politicians who've been trafficking in it. So the fourth finding that we want to put forward is that obviously you look around the world and you say, well, where is there pre-existing polarization, distrust, and partisan media? This is going to be a global problem. And in fact, the global south is going to be affected by this tremendously in future years and in elections, with a high risk of violence attached to it. So those were the findings that we had to tackle. And we had to think about issues of hate speech, weaponized disinformation, political advertising, foreign influence, and then how to protect electoral infrastructure. And we always came back to the fact that this is a systemic problem. You're going to need systemic solutions. Platforms are going to have to do stuff. Governments or public authorities are going to have to do stuff, and we want NGOs to do stuff. You have to build resilience against weaponized disinformation. You need capacity and you need norms. The capacity, we talk about stuff like it would be good to have an election violence index. That is, where are the countries that are most potentially affected by weaponized disinformation with a high valence on potential violence. The need to build partnerships between civil society and election authorities to counter hate speech and disinformation. The fact that international funders, development agencies need to think about how to support election management bodies throughout the world in terms of best cyber practice, in terms of best ways of countering disinformation. You need civic technology programs that deal not just with how to understand disinformation and how to identify disinformation, to do cyber literacy, but also you actually have to build up capacity in terms of who understands the interface between cyber issues and policy issues. And then finally, we talked about, in terms of international capacity, would it be valuable to have the equivalent of electoral cybersecurity teams, either built out of regional organizations or perhaps the United Nations, But somehow that countries that lacking capacity in terms of cybersecurity, they would have these teams that could drop in to assist them. Now, in terms of norms, there's a whole bunch of resilience norms that have to be created. The first one is that we really believe that in democratic election campaigns these days, you need candidate pledges and pacts, codes of conduct regarding digital advertising. You need democratic governments across the world to step up and think and codify what is legitimate election assistance from outside and what is electoral interference. Governments have to identify electoral systems as critical infrastructure. We need to create codes of conduct for the vendors and vendors of electoral machinery and services, and codes of conduct for political consultants worldwide. Now, in our report, we put forward a whole bunch of different specific steps. I won't go into all of them, but some important ones are we need, for instance, public authorities to compel the platforms to share their data with researchers. We need to protect that. There are privacy concerns, obviously, but so many of the questions regarding echo chambers and filter bubbles and so forth, or claims that YouTube algorithms, are radicalizing. You actually need researchers to have access to data. You need to compel the social media platforms to label accounts that use automation and fine them if they don't. Political authorities have to actually define what is political advertising. It shouldn't be left to the platforms to decide what is political advertising or not. You need to compel the platforms to share information about ad purchases. You probably need to create a minimum targeting size for ads. We recommended in the report that public authorities should create a 48-hour cool-off period for political advertising online. And then we also recommended that political authorities create digital media literacy programs and public interest programs around disinformation and how to detect it. The platforms, we believe that the platforms should allow users to opt out of political advertising. We think that the platforms should require ad buyers, political ad buyers, to pledge ethical digital content and sign codes of conduct. And if they don't, then they can't purchase ads online. They should publicly disclose who is buying their ads and paying for their ads. They obviously need much better cultural competency in local language for early warning systems in cases of disinformation and hate speech in elections. And even beyond that, it would be good for platforms to institute what are called speed bumps, automatic trigger of human review based on virality, human review of politically threatening content, and we recommended cooperation across the platforms to counter threats to electoral integrity, akin to what they do to fight child pornography and terrorism. Okay, so that was a whole bunch of recommendations. What's happened? Our report landed in January. We were already anticipating that the election in the United States would be ugly, it would be hate-filled, and it would be a tsunami of disinformation. And that disinformation would be both foreign and domestic. And of course, what wasn't anticipated was the global pandemic and the quarantines and lockdowns that were necessary to fight the pandemic. Now, the good news, at least from the United States, was, as I mentioned, there was a success in fighting disinformation. The election was incredibly well run. It's the highest percentage of voters since 1900. Most of this was because early voting and mail-in voting were used. But because of mail-in voting, you had a bifurcated electorate and an opening for Donald Trump to create his disinformation campaign based on mail-in voting as being insecure and a way to steal the election, that your vote won't be counted if you're a Republican. And so you had bifurcated use of mail-in voting, with Democrats using it predominantly and Republicans much less. And this became very important in terms of how the disinformation campaign played out during the election, with mail-in ballots, often because Republican legislatures said you can't start counting them until after Election Day. The first wave of voting was for Donald Trump, and then all of the voting that came in and was counted over the next 3 to 4 days in major states was Democratic. It was a blue wave. Now, despite all the efforts to delegitimize the election, and once again, I point to work done by Yochai Benkler at MIT that showed this whole campaign about the election being stolen, the lack of safety and security with mail-in ballots. This was not from the internet. It was from Donald Trump, and it was from Fox News. And that's where the blame and the accountability go. So nonetheless, the election was conducted with immense integrity, and it will yield a Democratic turnover in power in January. Why? First of all, civil society and universities were very active in terms of fact-checking and searching for disinformation and trying to identify it and counter it. The platforms actually got religion and were much more assertive. Twitter, Facebook in particular, much less so for YouTube. YouTube continues to get a free ride on a lot of this stuff. The media, I would argue, became more responsible in terms of calling out lies and disinformation and not simply playing the balance, he said, she said kind of traditional media effect. But nonetheless, we are going to have to deal with the consequences of this election for a long time, because it's very clear that you're going to have a Democratic turnover in power with about 40% of the electorate believing that the election was illegitimate. Now, these are hard problems, and I can just tell you that we're in a very schizophrenic moment. And let me just give you an example. My university, Stanford University, there are two different professors here who were both part of the Kofi Annan Commission. Nate Persily in the law school, Alex Stamos, who runs the Stanford Internet Observatory. They did incredible work. They and their teams did incredible work in fighting disinformation and creating an election with integrity over the last 8 months in the United States. At the same time that these folks were countering disinformation, working with electoral authorities on how to pull off this election during a pandemic, a guy named Scott Atlas, who was from the Hoover Institution at Stanford, became President Trump's chief medical advisor on the pandemic and was spouting disinformation left, right, and center, right? And Stanford's authorities, the president and provost, refused to do anything, said very little about this. The Stanford Faculty Senate voted to hold Atlas in contempt. But again, very few ramifications of this, and nobody is willing to make hard choices here. The fact that you have somebody using academic freedom to just spout lies about the efficacy of masks, of social distancing, about how you're going to get through this pandemic. That's the moment that we're in. Systemic problem, politicians, media, and social media. And we're going to need to hold all of them accountable if we want to get out of this disinformation moment. Thank you.